I can't, I'm going to stand there. Because the plan is to read mostly, and not to present. So the presentation was supported by INRIA, that Ms. Sarko has just referred to. This is a French institute for research in computer science and automation. And they're very passionate about this particular project. And it's based on a memorandum of understanding that UNESCO signed with them a while ago. And this is a spin-off of that MOU. So it goes without saying, of course, as we have just heard, that software is everywhere. It embodies a collective knowledge and cultural heritage. If you look at those two boxes there, that's a computing language. And to me, it's a gobbledygook. I mean, what exactly does it mean? And yet, it could, in fact, be so simplified as to say what the other box has got. Same lines. Hello world program. Printf, hello world, and so on and so forth. So, in one sense, the language is restricted to experts, to the neddies of this world. In the other instance, it becomes a more democratized language, a computing language which is intelligible. Now that is intelligent still, but here it becomes humanly intelligible. We understand what somebody was trying to communicate through the development of a particular code. So therefore, we could conclude that programs must be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute. Harold Eberson. And of course, the fact that code is embedded in our technological cultural fabric is also demonstrated here by the lead software engineer for Project Apollo. And look at the analog code that is there. That is a lot of knowledge. And it does require to be digitized. And if code is now written digitally, it is more likely to get lost. So it requires special attention. And therefore, we could say, therefore, that code is increasingly complex. Apollo modules counted approximately, look at that number, 145,000 lines of code, at least in analog. And our friends at INRIA, looking at research, tell us that Mac OS X Tiger registers more than 86 million lines, Facebook more than 60 million lines or more, and Linux kernel size in lines of code, and this is just the core code, if you will. If you look at this, you will discover that in fact it's over 28 million lines of code. That's a lot of code. And of course, we can say then that software is spread all around in many repositories, one of which, of course, has been referred to in the first presentation, GitHub, and the code is everywhere. It is reposed everywhere. It is also fragile and therefore easily endangered. But there are problems, particularly for code developers, or at least for the code developing industry. It is an industry, whether it is moneyed or not, it still is an industry and does need to have modes of sustainability. The problems are summed up over there. That scientific reproducibility is not guaranteed because code is given to loss more easily in the digital environment. So it is important to make sure that whatever research is conducted in this particular area, or indeed the very practice of writing code becomes reproducible. The idea of collaboration over distance, over time, and so on and so forth is important. And also, research software is undervalued. It is not treated in the same way as other research breakthroughs. Often, software developers are spread all over, young men, young women, unheard of, specializing in coding, and so on and so forth. And so the research that they do, because it is research, tends to be undervalued and is not recognized. Software research is under-recognized, particularly in universities. The focus tends to be on the hard sciences, where scientific breakthroughs are likely to be remunerated, to be recognized. And yet, in the background, you have people developing code on the basis of which machines operate, and so on and so forth. Those are problems. And so, in a sense, we are losing our heritage of the digital age with what we list there. Legacy software is abandoned or lost. Key people are passing away. And this is a key point in as far as INRIA is concerned, because they've identified great minds that were behind some of the most progressive software, source code that we have ever seen. And these are aging, and yet within them reside the kind of knowledge that in and of itself is a form of heritage. Their argument is we need to invite these people to important workshops so that they can speak about their experiences, so that they can say what it is that drove them to write certain types of code. In fact, the argument seems to be behind each code, there is a human story, the story of the code writer, and that story is implicated in other stories as well. We miss a catalog. We miss an archive. So given this background, UNESCO supports software heritage, the first and largest archive of software source code. And the mission is to collect, preserve, and share the source code of all available software. And one of the things being planned is the Great Library of Source Code. And this had its soft launch in June at UNESCO last year. And as part of that, we have 90 plus million software projects archived, 6 plus billion source files. And the question that is asked is, how is it possible to collect all source code? Well, the answer is it depends on availability. And these lines simply illustrate the points that have already been made. Online, if it is closed, bad news. Online, if it is open, good news. Offline and closed, worse news. Offline and open, better news perhaps. That's what that illustrates in a sense. In November 2018, a group of experts from research, industry, and memory institutions gathered in UNESCO and issued what we call the Paris Score on software source code as heritage for sustainable development. And I've got here this booklet which encapsulates the Paris Code. So please take a copy if you can. In this Paris Code, we try to encourage efforts to gather and preserve the artifacts and narratives of the history of computing while the earlier creators are still alive. That is self-explanatory, and it is very, very important in as far as this project is concerned. In October 2019, UNESCO, the University of Pisa in Italy, and INRIA responded to the call by issuing the software heritage acquisition process. Again, I've got a booklet which we've just published here, the software heritage acquisition process. It outlines what process can be taken in order to do that. And so in a nutshell, the process is inspired, if you will, by a naive view of the way archaeologists work. And Professor Hager should be able to tell us a lot more about archaeology, the archaeology of knowledge, and so on. First, on site, they collect and identify the finds. Then in the museum, they safely store, curate, and exhibit them. Often they come back on site for getting more information. Obviously, reality is much more complex and intertwined. What we have there is a diagrammatic representation of what is meant by that, and it is expanded upon in the booklet, and I'm not the expert to comment on this. I will not comment on this. It is also in the booklet. It simply goes into the minutiae of the collect phase and so on and so forth, and gives an example of how things would look. And this is an example of one of the first music synthesizers in the 70s, which was so represented, archaeologically represented, if you like. Now, to zero in briefly on the Paris call. First of all, what is important here is to understand the need for the process of software source code development, as I have outlined it, and support it, either in the abstract sense or concretely. I would argue concrete support is better, and that is what we are calling for in the Paris Accord. And also their implementation requirements, which are listed again there, issues such as long-term availability, historical accuracy, and these, I think, are identical with some of the issues that have already been highlighted today with respect to the guidelines for content selection and so on and so forth, and including even digital unification. Traceability, to what extent can you trace the software code that has been developed? These are issues that are important, and going forward, they're going to be important, especially if you're going to nominate a piece of software code for possible inscription on the Memory of the World International Register. These issues will have to be taken into account as well. The notion of openness, the necessity for interoperability, especially now to ensure continuing universal access to the code. So then, archiving software source code is not just about code. It is also about preserving the history of today's digital world, the stories of the men and women responsible for much of the impact on innovations in human history. And that should be it. Okay.